Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Interwoven, The Many Voices of Fiber, curated by Tracy Rieger. Today, we are thrilled to present artist Deborah Silver. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode. Please feel free to utilize that chat function and ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them during the Q&A portion of the hour. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there may be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks all and welcome, Deborah.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Am I ready to go? Okay, good. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for joining us. This presentation is in conjunction with the Interwoven show at the Rife Gallery, which if you have a chance to see it, it's on till July 7th. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my work now. And I want to start a little bit by just talking about how I got into weaving in the first place. And the answer to that is I never wanted to be a weaver. It was the last thing on my mind when I was in school. I mean, like in high school, I just thought I always wanted to be an artist, but weaving was not even on my radar. You know, when I thought about weaving, it was like, you know, ladies in colonial times, like Little House on the Prairie, weaving in their farmhouses. So it just wasn't even anything I considered. And I had done a lot of silk screening when I was in high school, and I really loved that process of breaking down an image into separate parts, separate color screens. And you really need to gel images down when you're doing silk screen because, you know, every time you add a color, you have to make a new screen and you have to make sure it's aligned. So you really have to gel images down to their simplest form. And I thought, hey, I'm going to be a silk screener. I'm going to go into printmaking or maybe graphic arts. And I went to the Cleveland Institute of Arts, and they had a great printmaking department, but they were very focused then on lithography and intaglio etching, but not really so much with the silk screening. But the fiber department was right across the hall, and they were doing all kinds of silk screening there. They were just doing it on cloth instead of on paper. So I thought, hey, maybe I should try going into the fiber department. My first year as a fiber major, I was supposed to take weaving, and there was a new teacher that was from the Netherlands teaching in the class next door. And I thought, hey, I really like her. And I went and I sat down in that class and I stayed there for the rest of the year. Nobody said anything. But the next year came around and I still didn't want to do weaving. And the head of the department told me that I was going to learn how to weave it if she had to tie me to the loom. So, and my issues with weaving had really to do with the fact that it's very linear. You're working with either vertical threads, which are the ones that you thread onto the looms, or the horizontal yarns that you're adding as you weave. And I just thought it was very restrictive, and I was always trying to break out of that. And this piece I did in college, where I was trying to do things that would break it out of that sort of flat imagery. So there's these dents that separate your threads when you thread it onto the loom, and there was this really rusty reed that's like the divider of the threads. And the teacher let me cut dents out of it so that I could thread these chunks of copper piping onto my selvages. So every time I wanted to add some copper piping into my weaving, I just pull them right through and weave them into the piece. And then I added more copper pipes afterwards so that I could make this 3D piece. This is another piece that I did in college. At that time, my mother worked as a rabbi secretary, and she brought me a Megillah that needed to be repaired. A Megillah is the book of Esther. It's on one scroll. And I modeled this piece after that book of Esther. It's about 11.5 feet long on the floor. And I wove these wooden dowels into it with slits so that I could have these stairs that came right off the piece. And then I added these vertical dowels are actually screwed right in through the piece on the bottom. So the whole thing can literally flatten out and get rolled up. There's a closer look at the steps. So it started out as one flat piece. After I graduated from college, well, I didn't actually graduate, but I was almost graduated, and then I left college. I started working in interior design doing commission work. So these are some of the commissions I made. A transparency for windows that uses inlay techniques. That one with the circles is a deflected double weave. So I was always trying to do things that sort of broke out of that blockish look that you would see in a lot of weave structures. Here's a couple more wall hangings that I did. The one on the right, I inserted all of that hand-dyed raffia afterwards, piece by piece. This is another commission wall piece. In this one, I was really trying to figure out a way that I could move from one weave structure to another. And I did it by, because I really didn't know what I was doing, but I was being very stubborn. I would put my shuttle through. The shuttle is what carries the horizontal yarn across, and carry it across to the place where I wanted to change and pull it out midway, change my treadling, put my shuttle back through so that I could get these curvy lines. And then it's pieced together after that. So this is like if you were looking from the side view of what these yarns look like. They're called warp yarns. Those are the ones that actually get threaded onto the loom. And you make something called a shed where you push down with your foot and it lifts threads up so that you get this big space. And through that space, you're adding the shuttle with the horizontal weft yarns that slide through that normal shed. This is what most weavers do. And you'll see them shooting that shuttle back and forth as they change their treadling. And I want to say one thing about tapestry. This is not my work. This is Maximo Lauro, who's a famous tapestry weaver. In tapestry, you'll notice that there's all these little bobbins with colored yarn. And what they do is they use a cartoon, and they're just like sort of coloring in the lines. They're filling in. My weaving, all of those weft yarns go from selvage to selvage. That's what differentiates it from tapestry. I use something called a split shed. What that does is it makes a center layer of warp yarns that are going, it splits the top and the bottom layers so that you can choose where you want to see more of that horizontal line yarn if you put it on the top, or you can move it into that lower shed if you want to see less of it. So this is a photo of what it would look like when I'm throwing that purple yarn through. On the right side, that horizontal yarn is below the middle layer. So you can kind of tell it's less noticeable, and you can see where I want it to come up. And it gives you so much freedom because you can, you don't have to worry about making things blocky. You can just make as many changes as you want all the way across. And that's really advantageous for weavers who have simpler looms, like 4-shaft looms. Most weavers only have 4 or 8-shaft looms. When you see those really complicated things, those are usually done on computer looms or really multiple shaft looms. And I really try to keep it to 4 shafts because I have found that there are so many things you can do with this technique, different weave structures you can create with only 4 shafts. And you can blend colors in this technique. So you can have 2 colors going through that same split shed and blending in places where they both come up to the top at the same time. And in that way, you can create a 3rd color. There's a close-up of doing a 2 weft color piece, and you can see the cartoon behind this. So those transitions are made wherever you see those cartoon lines hitting the fell of the cloth. I worked for 10 years as a nuclear medicine technician, and I found out that I was losing my job. At that time, I had been doing split shed weaving for probably about 8 years, and a lot of people had been saying, why can you come and teach us? And I thought, I'm not going to use my valuable vacation time to come to your town and teach. But then I found out I was getting laid off, and I started putting the word out, and I said, you know, if I'm going to teach this technique, you know, I had only been doing it in this one weave structure that you see on the cover of the book here. It's tied Biderband. And I said, I'm going to start exploring every single weave structure you can do using this technique on 4 shafts. And a year and a half later, I had a book. So this is one of the weave structures that mixes summer and winter with 4-tie twill weaving. So it's 2-sided, and it's the 4 ancient elements. So it's earth, fire, water, and air. So this is one side of a tote bag, and this is the other side that is the same elements, just done in a more graphic way. This is the whole bag. And I started to do things that were a little bit more functional, really just because most weavers out there they're craft weavers. They're weaving functional things. They're making scarves and baby blankets and, you know, all kinds of beautiful things. And it's really important to me to let them know that there are ways that you can incorporate more like craft artsy things into your crafts. I don't really get too much into the arts and crafts argument, just because, I mean, you can't be an art weaver and not acknowledge the fact that there is so much history in the crafts of weaving. I mean, and it's everywhere. It comes from every culture. Everyone has contributed to it. So you're really doing yourself a disservice not to acknowledge this wonderful history we have in the craft world. I went to Venice, Italy a couple of times, and this is a photograph I took of this architectural element that was in the upstairs of the St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. And I wanted to incorporate this into a piece. The weave structure here is called tied Latvian. It makes these nice vertical ridges. And I combined 2 different colors here. So I've got a blue and a tan, and then you can see where they're both mixing to make the image. And this is tied Lithuanian, which is another version of that. So this is the whole tote bag. So, I mean, you can take really artsy things and put them into your crafts. And the other thing I like to play with is the qualities of the yarn themselves. So this is just your basic double weave that I did using split shed weaving, but the orange is done in linen and the blue is a shrinkable merino wool. You know, and you can see on the right the before and after. I wet finished it in hot water, and boy, that wool really shrunk up, and it gave me just what I wanted. I wanted the leaves to look like they were blowing in the wind. This is another double weave scarf where I've played with different sets. So one layer is much more open than the other layer, so you can see one layer through the other. And you can also do horizontal and vertical stripes. And I should mention that this one and the last one and that Venetian tote bag were all made using the same warp, the same vertical yarns that were threaded the same way on the loom. That's one thing I love to do, is see how many different structures I can get with one warp and one threading. And that's also a lot of fun. Also, I just hate threading my loom, so I tried to do as much as I can with, one threading. And this is my waffle weave scarf. This is done with all embroidery floss, warp and weft. What I'm kind of been known for a while is doing these faces. I'm really into like this whole cultural heritage thing of weaving, but also faces in general and masks and tribal faces, because I think they're so emotive. And there's so many cultures that we're losing. And I think it's really important to sort of remember that they're there and try to access them. Like these figures are kulap figures from the island of New Ireland. In this culture, when someone died, you would go to these sculptors that lived near the limestone mountains, and they would make these sculptures called kulap, and you'd bring it home and it would stay in a special sacred house where the spirit would stay until it went into the afterlife. And they were somehow at some point they would be mysteriously broken, and that's how you would know that the spirit has moved on into the next life. But because of missionary work and Christianity coming in, there's really no worship of kulap anymore. Yet you could still get these little sculptures because tourists like them. And you know that they were not used for ceremony because you can see them. They're not destroyed. But I just love these particular ones because they're a lot of tribal imagery is a little bit intimidating looking. A lot of them can be very like scowling or mysterious, but these are really smiling and happy looking, and they have these really huggable arms. And I wanted to put something into these arms. So I sort of made it about your children growing up and growing too big for your, and growing up and becoming more independent on their own. And the way I work, I don't really have an idea when I start. I'm kind of a collector. I collect faces. I collect all these images, and I'll take them and I'll break them up into dark, medium, and light, and just kind of have them around. And once I get a pile and I'm ready to start doing something new, I'll spread them all out on the floor and really see where a conversation is happening. And then I'll overlap the drawings and start coloring them in and adding and subtracting until I find an image that I like. So it's a long design process. And the thing about weaving is when you're using a cartoon, all these big decisions have to be made before you start, because, once you have the loom threaded and you're starting it, it's all really, you have to choose the colors. Once you're weaving, it's all these tiny little decisions, but all the big decisions have been made. The piece on the upper left is I wove first, and I really just loved this sort of face emerging from this dark hood. The piece on the bottom left is from an archaeological magazine. It's a fragment of it's a sacrum bone from the Lucayan people. They're the first people that Columbus encountered when he came to the New World. And because of just famine and disease and starvation and enslavement, they lasted about 30 years after that. And I used this face to sort of humanize this bone, to represent that this was a culture, this was a people. My friend Mary Urbis at Lakeland Community College does this skull and skeleton show every 2 years. And I contributed these pieces for her show. I love skulls and skeletons. They're a lot of fun to work with. This is a Balul figure from the Ifugao people in the Philippines. They're always in male and female pairs, and they're ancestral figures that are meant to protect your home and your crops. And they're always very serene looking. They're meant to bring a sense of peace, a sense of calm. And I used this human face that was very anxiety ridden, that was outward looking, as opposed to this very serene, inward looking figure, as just a contrast that if you want to find tranquility, you need to look within, not without. This is one of the pieces from the Interwoven exhibition. And this is in the split shed tied Beiderbunt, where I'm blending this dark blue with a white, and you can see where the shaded parts are. And if you're a weaver and you're wondering where the pink comes, that's the tabby. When I was working as a nuclear medicine technician, because it was like an X-ray, environment, there were no windows around. There was a big room with the PET scan or CAT scan in it, and you're sitting outside of it and doing your calibrations, or you're inside working on it, but there are no windows. And you go a whole day and not see what's going on outside. You can't see the sky. So it was a little bit depressing in that way. So I made this piece, and it's actually, there's like an African mask in there. But I didn't notice until after it was off the loom and somebody pointed it out to me that there's a dragonfly there. I didn't see the dragonfly, and I didn't design it to look like a dragonfly. That's just one of the surprises that happens. This is another Balul figure, and whenever I see something in the middle of the forehead like that, I immediately think third eye, which in Buddhism, it's like the spiritual eye, the God's eye, seeing the world in a spiritual way. And the only thing human in this piece is that human eye looking through that hole, trying to view the world in a more spiritual way. So that you can see the drawing here on the left, and a lot of people are always commenting, that my pieces seem so detailed. How do you get so much detail? But we are hardwired to see faces, and I think a lot of times people think there's more detail than there really is, because we so immediately see faces in things. There's that whole pareidolia thing, with like the man on the moon, or the face of Jesus in a piece of toast. We're just hardwired to see faces, and you really don't, if you look at the drawing, you don't really have to have as much detail as you think to make something that looks like a human face. Oh, and the piece on the right is a Bering Sea sculpture. The Bering Sea people used to incise designs on tusks, walrus tusks. It's the culture that existed about 2,000 years ago, when you could still cross over the Bering Sea Straits. Here's a couple other pieces that I did with ethnic imagery and human faces. This is the inside of a Sittapati mask. It's an Indian cemetery mask. And when you go on these sites that have a lot of masks that are real antiques, they always show them from all sides. And I just love this mysterious looking in the inside of this mask. It's the eye holes. And if you think about when someone's wearing a mask, the only place that you can see the real human is through these eye holes. So if you really want to know what's going on in there, you have to really peer in. So I have this person looking through those eye holes, trying to see the person behind the mask. This is another piece that's in the Interwoven exhibition. The drawing on the left is from a ancient goddess figurine. And I combined it with a photograph of a woman from the era when women in the United States were fighting for their right to vote. And it's my Women's March piece, so that's why I used the pink. It's called Planning the Revolution. There's a detail of it. The piece on the right is a Mochica jaguar god, the tribal image. They think that the sound of thunder is this god. It's called Bad Night Moon. This is another ancient goddess figurine, and I used it to do these two pieces that I call veiled. And that's a little bit of a commentary about how we perceive women who wear face like veils. And I grew up in this Orthodox Jewish neighborhood where women covered their elbows and their knees, and if you were married, you covered your hair. And I think we just have this sort of perception sometimes, this visceral thing where we think subjugated woman when we see someone who's wearing the veil, and we kind of forget about how strong these women have to be where they live and in the countries where they're from, but also the fact that they also, a lot of them have these very strong beliefs. And you know, if you had asked one of these Orthodox women in my neighborhood, why are you allowing yourself to be so subjugated? They would say, what are you talking about? I'm just following the tenets of my faith. So I think we need to be just a little bit more understanding. This vessel is from the Wari people. This is a culture that existed until about 1,000 years ago in ancient Peru. They lived in the mountains, and they actually died out because of climate change. They had an extended drought and just simply couldn't live up there anymore. I paired this vessel with a friend of mine, Hillary, who, because she has some disabilities, and especially during COVID, became very, very isolated, you know, where she really wasn't able to leave her apartment. And she has such a strong spirit. I really wanted to put her in this vessel, but showing that her spirit is just shining forth despite being encapsulated. This is my Ode to David Bowie piece that I made after he died. It's really 4 pieces put together. Each one is 16 by 20. And the imagery that's with him is also Wari. They did these incredible tapestries, and the archaeologists think that based on other cultures that are surrounding them, and they're just the weird shapes of their animal tapestries, that they represented the constellations. So I used them as a way of showing that, you know, sort of David Bowie sort of up in the constellations now. And I got to this point when I had been doing a lot of work, and I had these pieces that I didn't quite think were done. But we put so much love and work into our weavings that it can be very, very hard to cut into them because they become very precious. So sometimes you have to leave things go for a few years before you go back and say, okay, I'm getting out the, you know, the knife. But I had at one point really started looking at going really much deeper into history and looking at petroglyphs and cave paintings. And I started cutting into my work, and I would, because these are kind of heavy pieces, they're like 1/8 of an inch deep. I immediately painted the inner edges with acrylic paint, and that added a nice edge to it. And it also acted as a glue to help keep it from fraying. And then I would add other materials behind. So the cutouts here are ancient Neanderthal bones from an archaeological dig. This is also a petroglyph with a kabuki mask. I think kabuki theater is just really mysterious, just because it's so odd to me, and I have no idea what's happening when I'm, you know, seeing it. But so I made this sort of story to go with the mask. These are two more petroglyphs. The one on the right is a self-portrait that I paired with this petroglyph that had earrings that I thought, what a great way to go into battle. And yeah, they're both petroglyphs. This image I just love. It's from an Anasazi site. This building is called Inscription House. And I love the dichotomy on the upper left of this light, airy, open to everything window. And then at the bottom, this very dark, mysterious opening. And I wanted to incorporate that in some way into a piece. In this one, the upper left is this really intensively worked piece of silk. It's just a scrap of it where you make a screen and you have to make this paste where you make a dough first, and there's a big process with that, and then there's natural dyes. So the whole thing takes a really long time. And at the bottom is a modern upholstery fabric. These are ancient ostrich shell beads, the shapes that I blew up really big. And it's sort of a commentary just about ornamentation and how some people go overboard with ornamentation. Lapis is another weave structure that I was experimenting with, that you can also blend colors in. This particular piece is a piece about my father, who was a metallurgical engineer, and he would leave the house really early in the morning, usually before I even woke up, to go to work. And I was never really able to see where he worked because it was a steel factory. So this is sort of my imagination of what it looked like with the sun coming up over the factories, with the smokestack in front of like the blinds of his office window. And if you look carefully at the bottom, you'll see a mug of coffee with the steam rising up that's sort of blending in with all that factory smog. This is another, and I like to experiment with weave structures that do different things. And PK just naturally makes these puffy areas of like naturally quilts. Especially, so there's these stitched areas where you can see like the little dots. That's this stitcher warp that's coming up and pulling. It's a 2-layered weave structure. That stitcher pulls those layers together, but where it's puffy, the 2 layers are separate. And in between, there's something called a stuffer weft or a water weft that goes across. And it gets compressed between the 2 layers in the stitched areas. But once you get it in hot water, that stuffer warp, it just puffs everything up. And it's a really beautiful weave structure. Because Lapis and PK can use the same threading, I wanted to do a piece that used both of those techniques. So at the top and bottom of this piece, I used the PK, the puffy fabric, and then in between I did the Lapis with 2 color wefts. And I call it my COVID lockdown piece. It's called The Language of Waiting, because I see hash marks as being the language of waiting. There's a detail. So I'm blending a blue and a brown here. This is a very narrative, personal piece that I made, and it's about 20 inches square, but it's a very deep piece. And it started out as a story that I wrote about me and my father. He died when I was 17 years old. And because it started out as a written story and then became a piece of art, I wanted words to be in the piece itself. And I made a frame out of these wooden alphabet blocks that we all play with when we're kids. So there's words that go all the way around the front and the sides. You can see here's where I'm building up the blocks. The whole thing's put together with wood glue and hopes and dreams. And then there's an ancient petroglyph from Utah there. I really like that petroglyph that there was this larger, more imposing figure with a small figure. And I built slits into this piece, and I also wove metal rods across the piece so that it would have some structure. So here you can see the metal rods. Holes are drilled then inside the frame, so these metal rods could fit inside the holes and make the stairs literally step back into the frame. So this is the whole piece where you can see the metal rods, how they're fitting into the frame. It starts out as one stairway and then breaks off into two separate stairways. And then my baby shoes in there and old family photographs. That's an Anasazi window. The words come from, I did a Cleveland Jewish Arts and Culture Fellowship, and the theme of it was slavery and freedom. And one of the things that the rabbi talked about was when Moses was up on Mount Sinai, and God was trying to convince him, you got to tell people, they need to follow me. And Moses said, well, how am I going, what am I going to tell them? What do I say? And God says, I am that I am. And I remember being a kid and thinking like, yeah, that's going to fly. Like, yeah, that's all you got to say and they'll just follow you. But what the rabbi said was, if you translate it more literally from the Aramaic, it's, I am what I am becoming. And I thought that was so much more meaningful, because we're not just what we already did in the past or what we are now, but we're also our potential. We are what we are becoming. And that's also part of us. This is the beginning of another piece. They say that artists we don't make messes. We just have a lot of ideas lying around. But it's true. And this is one of those things where I saw this image on Facebook, and it's just this 300-year-old ancient Chinese abacus ring. And I just thought it was so cool. And I looked it up because I didn't even really know how abacuses worked, or abaci, I guess. And it's called a swan pond, and it's in base 16, where like the number system we use is the decimal system, where there's 10, 0 through 9 numbers in every space. Like binary has just 2, 0, and 1. Hexadecimal has 16 in every space. And hexadecimal is used a lot in like engineering and computer language. So I thought I wanted to do something that had to do with math that incorporated this abacus. So I started looking for mathematicians, and of course, ta-da, Einstein. And I put him in with ancient Greek math symbols that we use today, like pi. But while I was reading up on Einstein, and that he was a German Jew and he was a pacifist, and he had still property when Hitler came to power. He still had a home in Germany, but he wasn't living there at the time. I like to wait and let things gel and let things happen and not create things all at once, because one thing kind of leads into another. And it was Holocaust Remembrance Day, and someone had posted an article about the MS St. Louis, which is the boat that came over from Germany with over 900 Jews, and most of them did not have visas, and we would not let them enter the country. So they had to go back to Europe. They were taken in by 4 other European countries, but 3 of them were invaded by the Nazis, and about 27% of those Jews ended up dying. And I thought, Einstein, being a German Jew, that he could easily have been one of these people. And, it's just like you never know what you're losing in history. So I wanted to do something that would incorporate these Jews. So I played with this threading, and this is before I had actually started weaving anything. This is a sort of a mock-up that I was doing because I wanted to do a representation of these Jews in flames in this same weave threading on the same loom. And I was also thinking, because border and wall had been such a big thing in the news, I wanted to incorporate that somehow. And wall also, references the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, the Western Wall. People put prayers on paper and put them into the cracks of that wall. So this mock-up is, I took paper and folded it up into Stars of David, and then I partially burned it. So this is the actual woven part that I did. So all of the black ones that you see here represent the Jews that died on the MS St. Louis. And I wrote Einstein's theories and formulas on these pieces of paper that had been folded up into Stars of David, and partially burned them and put them into the piece itself. And the abacus became barbed wire. So I made this frame, and I burned Einstein's formulas and theories into it. And I put this copper sheeting on the sides of the frame to sort of reference a ship. So this is the entire piece that is in the Interwoven show. But again, it's a long process. And that's kind of the way I work, because I think it's really important to let your ideas gel. And we don't always have that chance, like when we're in art school, because you're always working for that next critique. But if I'm going to give somebody advice, it's, let things happen, because you never know, what you're going to see. Another thing that I did during the COVID lockdown, because I work so meticulously, is I said, I'm going to try and do something that makes me uncomfortable, which is not have a cartoon. And I said, okay, I'm going to just choose my colors and all this embroidery floss that I had, and choose a weave structure and not have a cartoon, and just see how these colors combine and see how it flows as I weave, and not have a plan. So I did 4 of these pieces. So when Woolworths closed way back 20 plus years ago, I ended up with a garbage bag full of their embroidery collection, which stayed in a crawl space in my attic until the COVID lockdown. And that's when I went and spent 2 days sorting all these beautiful colors out. That I was like the kid with the biggest box of crayons. It was great. So I did 3 more of these pieces. And Saori is it's not a weave structure, it's a type of weaving, it's a philosophy that is more intuitive, where there are no mistakes, and you just kind of weave as you go along, and it's just a different way of weaving. So I wanted to incorporate that philosophy into these pieces that I made with no cartoons. So during the COVID lockdown, I did a lot of walking, and I live right near Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland. It's this huge cemetery that was established in 1869, although there's graves there that predate that. And there's so many incredible things in this cemetery. If you're ever in the area, definitely go there. It's an English garden cemetery, so it's got lots of greenery. This window is from a crypt, and I wanted to incorporate that into a piece. So this is PK, that weave structure that I was talking about earlier, that I also incorporated areas of Bedford cord. That's those horizontal ribs you see. But this piece is just all about the texture. And this is a window from President Garfield's tomb. The windows themselves are fairly simple, But I love that you could see the trees through the stained glass. So I converted this to black and white so I could really just concentrate on all this unique things, the refraction that was happening. And I made these two pieces in thin weave, which is a form of double weave. And this is just another one of those crazy things you notice once you start hanging out at old cemeteries. I have no idea why there's door knockers on crypts. There just are. And I'm actually thinking for my next series of putting door knockers in my pieces. This is a family marker, family plot from, I call it Augustus's tomb because it's the Augustus family. And on that plaque at the back is a poem that Anthony Augustus wrote in 1925 called Dreamland. And it's about like, what if you died and you found out that this whole life had just been a dream? Like, how would you approach that? And if the ticket to going to heaven was forgetting everything you just lived, would you still want to go? So it asks a lot of philosophical questions that I thought were really interesting. And it has this beautiful, fanciful ironwork on the sides. So I incorporated that into my next piece because the other thing I noticed was there are an awful lot of tombstones with women's names on them that have no end dates. But you know that the women are not alive anymore because of the birth dates, or you can see the date that their husband was buried. And when I say a lot, I mean like I'm keeping track, and I'm about 300. So it's a lot. And I think it's this beautiful mystery. And I know I could probably do research and find out what happened to most of them. But I love the mystery of it. I love thinking about what they could have done. So I made this piece that has those architectural elements in it with some of these actual tombstones. It's actually 21 pieces put together. And all of the weft yarns in this are embroidery floss. It was kind of important for me to use the embroidery floss because in the Victorian era, that was a big thing. It was a way to judge women, really, how well they did their needlework. And just to give you an idea of the scale, it's a really big piece. It took me from September to this February. So if you're interested in my book or seeing more of my work, you could just go to my website, Deborah Silver Studio. I also, if you're interested in split shed weaving and want to kind of see more about how it works, I do have a demo on YouTube. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Perfect. All right, Deborah. So while we're waiting for any questions that might come in, let's you and I start with a standard question that I like to ask artists, which is, tell us about a day in the studio with you. What are your rituals, or how do you like set the stage and get yourself started? Tell us about a day in the studio with you. Set the stage for us.
I'm kind of a neurotic weaver. Once I get to weaving, I am very focused, and it's hard to get me to get up. And I'll often listen to the radio instead of like a CD or something, just because if a really bad song comes on the radio, then I'll get up because otherwise I will never get up, and I'll find myself like weaving very angrily, like, why am I so angry? And it's like, oh, because I've had to get up to like go to the bathroom for like an hour, and I like to say that cursing is a part of my creative process. I am not a placid weaver. I do, and also I beat very hard. The harder you beat the yarns in, the more dense it's going to be, the more ends per inch you can get, the more detail you can get. So I really beat the hell out of it. So between the cursing and the beating, and then I've got, you've got the ratchet where you're rolling it forward. So there's that big clanking sound of the ratchet turning. Every once in a while, my husband will, yell up the stairs like, did the prisoner talk yet? Have you tried the cat o' nine tails? So yeah, if I ever have a blog, I will call it the angry notes from the angry weaver. I'm like the opposite of what most, you imagine most weavers to be.
So you've you dove into weaving and just never looked back. Do you ever uh, jump into and maybe sketch in other mediums, or is it like you found a love and it's here and that's it?
Yeah, I kind of found my thing. At some point, I think I will get back into silk screening. But I mean, if you look at my work, like the faces, it's really that same design setup, you know, because I'm only using two colors, and when I'm weaving across, um, and it's kind of that same thing with silk screening, you're trying to gel it down to as few colors as possible.
So we have a comment from Linda who says, thanks, Deb, for a great presentation. Looking forward to your workshop next fall, especially like the Saori style. And she has lots of thoughts. So um, the one thing that I think is really remarkable often about textile weaving, fiber works in general, is there is this deep want to touch them.
Oh,
Like y'all make work that has this undulating surface, and it's familiar. And so can you talk a little bit about the importance of that play? Because that is for sure a part of it. Like you're particularly with the ones that where you put them into hot water and they bunch up, that there's a texture there. So can
yeah.
you talk a little bit about that?
I think it's just because people grow up with it so close to them. And I'm sure you've noticed it. There's something about textiles that people can't help themselves. They want to touch it. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen people in gallery shows touching my stuff that would never think to touch a painting. It's like it's so close to us, we grow up with textiles everywhere, we sleep on textiles, our couches, our rugs, everything is tactile. So I just think it's one of those things that we feel on a more personal level.
Great. We have another comment from Marion, who said she doesn't actually have a question. She just wanted to say how captivating she found this talk, and Miss Silver's breadth of interest and knowledge of various cultures was fascinating. Sense of humor is infectious, and I appreciate her ability to find inspiration in so many different sources. She's not a weaver, but after this, she's tempted to try it, and she's
You should. There's weavers guilds everywhere.
Indeed. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about community in the weaving arena?
Weavers have the best community. They're awesome. And I think it's just because it's such an old craft. I mean, I know there's a lot of crafts where people are so secretive about their process and they don't want to share like how they got that glaze or how they made different things. There's nothing in weaving that hasn't already been done. Even this whole split shed weaving thing, maybe nobody thought to do lampas and split shed weaving, but we're all just building on this huge, beautiful past. There's nothing original. I mean, some of the jacquard weavers maybe, that are making these really complex images. And I'm not dissing that because, my whole thing is the reason I'm keeping it to 4 shafts, which is the really pretty basic loom, is because I want it to be accessible to a lot of people. But that said, I mean, there's like Oksana Dallas, who's also in the Interwoven exhibition that's working on a TC1 computer loom. Her work is incredible. I mean, she has just taken that medium, that equipment, and made it into really just taking it to the nth degree. So I really think it's just about taking what you have and really pushing it to its limits.
And I think we have a good final question. So after the next series that you intend to incorporate perhaps door knockers, what is next? What do you think is next?
You should see my pile of stuff to try. I mean, first of all, I'm still exploring all the different weave structures I can make with 4 shafts with split shed weaving. I mean, at some point, I'm just going to have to do an expanded edition of my book because I mean, I have this idea where I can mix honeycomb with turned Bedford cord. I mean, I just want to try everything. Plus, I want to do like art. Plus, I want to work on my book. You know, it's just there's too much out there. So yeah, I don't know exactly what's next, but I'm definitely going to start going to a lot of antique shops and looking for like old hardware like door knockers and hasps and things that I can incorporate in with this whole cemetery theme.
I think we actually have the real last question here from Philip, who bought your book and bought it for his birthday and loves it. And he's tried the technique with the double weave and would like to know if you have any suggestions to try lampas for the very first time using the split shed technique.
Oh, I'm the wrong person to ask because I'm always like balls to the walls, you know, like just dive right in. Just don't choose. I always say start with the simple designs. I mean, my students always start with pairs because, you know, first of all, they're weird looking to begin with. So if you get a little out of the line or, you know, the lines overlap weird, it doesn't matter, but those are always really great for color blending. So just start simple and then get more complex.
Perfect.
But contact me because I'm always happy to give advice.
There you go, Philip. Reach out. And that's a perfect kind of capstone on this. Again, thank you, Deborah, so much for the generosity of your time and talent and for being in this great exhibition.
Thank you.
Thank you to Tracy Rieger for putting together this great exhibition. Also, a big thank you to the governor, the legislature, and the Ohio Arts Council's board for supporting the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks everyone for joining us and have a great day.